Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Caregiver's Toolbox, tools for everyday caregiving, where we give you information and education on senior care topics. My name is Ryan McAniff. I am the owner of Minute Women Home Care. I am also the host of this wonderful podcast, and I am joined today with special guest, Halee Burg. Halee, how is everything going? And thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's always really exciting for me to be able to share more about this work, with people who both, who are working in the field and just people in terms of general interest, because it's not something that a lot of people are familiar with.
Absolutely. I mean, mediation is something that when we first spoke, it was not something that I had really experienced with a one-to-one previously, being 10 years in senior care. So certainly there seems to be a little bit of work that needs to be about getting the word out about mediation, which I'm glad you're able to come on the podcast, because so many times you being me, I can be in this industry for 10 plus years and still be learning new things. And so I think anybody in any industry is going to learn new things. So how about, we have three things that we're going to really get to explain to people about what you do and what your process is. And it's general enough that people out in California to Alaska to Florida can utilize this information to find somebody that might be able to be local to them, or if they wanted to use you, maybe you can do Zoom. But how did you get into this, and kind of what's your background, and how did you get into this type of industry?
Okay, thanks so much. So it's an interest, for me at least, I find the story kind of interesting. So I'm also an attorney, and I view my career as having kind of three facets, really going from the most adversarial to the least adversarial in terms of conflict resolution. So I started out my career more decades ago than I really care to count, as a litigator out in California, where I went to law school. And so, working with clients and companies in terms of, regular, what we think about as a traditional lawsuit. And did that for several years, and then moved back to the East Coast and was raising a family, and kind of quickly decided that being a litigator wasn't really consistent with my version of raising a family and being a parent. So I moved away from litigation, and I spent the middle part of my career in higher ed. I was working in the Boston area at Northeastern University, and was basically an advisor on legal affairs within the administration. And about a little over a decade ago, my own family was launched at that point, and I decided it was really time for something different. And my time at Northeastern was certainly in a conflict resolution role, but it was really much more collaborative, certainly, than my work as a litigator. But it also, I wasn't doing mediation per se. I've been interested in mediation for a long time, so I decided to take some mediation training, and I just loved it, and found that it was really very consistent with kind of my view of conflict, a completely different way to resolve conflict, of people working together collaboratively. And I became honestly quite passionate about it. And both through a series of things that were happening within my own family, personally, in terms of, aging parents and so forth, as well as professionally, I ultimately decided to focus a large part of my practice on elders and adult families, and helping them to work together through conflicts, which sometimes are inevitable, even in the strongest of families, when you're dealing with very emotional and challenging topics, to help families work together to problem solve and better communicate.
Yeah, I mean, so it sounds like summarize that you took the path out from the West to doing the litigation, and realizing that wasn't for you, to making it out to the East Coast, and learning that mediation was more of where you wanted to be, and it was more of a collaborative effort rather than litigation. It's basically, I guess, I don't have a lot of experience, but it's one-on-one. Who can convince a jury or whoever the best about what side is correct and what side might be wrong. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting avenue that a lot of people can relate to, that you have to take some risks and try a few different things before you can find your path on what you're really meant to do and what works well with your personality and your worldview and your morals and what you believe in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I just want to touch for a moment on what you said in terms of litigation. It is much more about, at least whether it's the jury's view or the judge's view, right, parties being much more pitted against one another. It's adversarial. People end up in litigation and trials because they're not able to resolve their differences in a collaborative way. And, my goal is to help people avoid certainly the emotional stress, and the time and the expense of ending up, particularly with families in that kind of a setting, and keeping them out of court.
Absolutely. And we've all heard probably a similar story where two people are divorcing and it's getting contentious, and the lawyer's sitting there, and probably both lawyers are on the same side saying, hey, listen, you're going to spend 50 grand whether you like it or not. You can give the 50 grand to your spouse, you can give it to me, but you're not going to have 50 grand or whatever the number is at the end of this thing. Why wouldn't you try to do some type of mediation and figure out, like, instead of going through the stress of all these things? That's certainly that would be certainly the smart avenue to go. But sometimes, like you said, emotions are so high that people are ready to blow up the world as long as it affects their ex-spouse. But the point being is that, without a doubt, that's where mediation can come into effect, and cooler heads can hopefully prevail, and there's a lot less aggravation and headaches, and you can move on and heal sooner than long litigation that could take months, and with COVID probably now is taking years and years, right?
Well, I mean, it's all of it. So true, Ryan. It's funny that you happen to mention divorce mediation, because I do that also. And your little kind of anecdote, about the money, right? I mean, I'm sure we'll get into that, because to a greater or lesser degree, I find that in almost all mediations, right, even in adult family mediations, it is not uncommon that there's an element of financial concern, that money is involved. But particularly in divorce mediation, but also with adult families, it's about whether you want to put the lawyer's kids through college or your own. And sometimes working with clients, and it would be more on the divorce side, I'll even say something like that in a gentle way to clients, to again try to kind of keep them thinking in a collaborative mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that people have kind of an idea of where you came from and how you got into this, we're going to be talking about kind of three general topics that are going to allow people to understand what mediation does, especially in a family situation. The first is kind of the general, what is adult family elder mediation? How does it differ from other types of mediation? The second is going to be more looking at what the process looks like. What can families expect when they're looking at adult family mediation? And then third and finally, when should families consider adult family mediation, and maybe some of the situations that lead to looking into that type of process and those types of services. So we can start off with number one. I mean, when we're talking about adult family elder mediation, certainly I know that we are working in extraordinarily stressful situations, kind of like what you said. In the best of circumstances, the common denominator is that somebody's declining, somebody's died, people are grieving, or people are in the act of grieving as somebody maybe has cancer and they're going to be passing away. That's already got stress levels super high. And then, like you said, put money involved, you tripped me when I was 9 years old running down the hallway involved, and then you have a powder keg ready to go. How does that look like? We certainly know about those stresses, but for people out there that are listening, what is a common situation where adult family, when does that come in, an adult family elder mediation? How does that differ from other types of mediation?
So I'm going to answer that in a couple of different ways. First, I want to respond in terms of what the most common scenario is, both in terms of the scenarios really and the timing of those scenarios. And I guess I would say sort of regretfully or regrettably, most often, the families come to us when they're, pretty close to a crisis mode or already in a crisis mode. And what I mean by that is that there are decisions that really need to be made, maybe already should have been made, for example, about, the care of a loved one, perhaps who's just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. We can think of many different scenarios. And the communication with the family, within the family, has broken down. Very often decisions are not being made. Most common scenarios involve adult children, adult siblings, who just simply have, very different perspectives on whatever the topic is, whether the topic is caregiving roles and responsibilities, or, where an aging loved one should reside in the future. And, I think one of the really important things to keep in mind is that it doesn't, generally involve any ill intentions. Everybody is well-intentioned usually within a family and shares common interests in terms of what is important to them is the health and safety of their parent or their other loved one. So as I said, very often they come to us at what at least we perceive as a crisis point, and things ideally would happen very quickly. In those situations, sometimes it's really hard to put the cases together very quickly. First of all, you got to get everybody on board, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So you've got these sort of crisis-driven scenarios, right? Which obviously raises the stress level for everyone. And as you said, it is very often a powder keg. The other scenario is that for people to come to mediation when they're less crisis driven and more in planning mode. So for example, sometimes it might involve an estate planning scenario where a parent or parents are trying to decide who the decision makers are going to be in the event that they're not able to make decisions in the future, whether it be decisions around finances. They're trying to figure out, which adult child would serve as the hold the power of attorney, or whether it's, who's going to serve as the healthcare agent, those kinds of planning scenarios. And typically, those lend themselves to being less crisis driven, but also so important and so helpful for those decisions to happen in a collaborative way. So I kind of see those as, two different but very ripe areas for adult family mediation. And at its heart, what adult family / elder mediation really is all about, it's really facilitated negotiation. It's working with families to help them have, the hardest, sometimes what feel like the hardest conversations. And we try to make those hard conversations easier. We try to help them to understand for each topic what's important to them about that topic, and move them from what we think about in the world of negotiation as their positions. And so what is a position? Well, a position is what an individual family member wants. So for example, mom or dad is getting older, perhaps both of them. There are 3 or 4 adult children. There are concerns about mom or dad continuing to reside in the family home. It's big, they can't manage it anymore, at least from the kids' perspective. The parents may or may not feel differently. And everybody has a different view on what should happen. Perhaps one adult child wants mom or dad to move in with them, and somebody else thinks they should go to assisted living. And maybe somebody who lives in closer to proximity to them feels like they're doing just fine. Let's just bring someone in to do some modifications to the home. The idea being that what each of the family members wants is their position. And so what we try to do in adult family mediation is to shift the conversation from what it is they want, in other words, again, their position, to why they want it. And so when you start talking about why you might want mom or dad to stay in the house, or why you might want them to move in with you, or why you think that it would be best for them to be in assisted living, for example, we're actually going to probably hear common answers. And that's going to be, I want them to be safe. I want them to be happy, healthy. And, for one or more of them, maybe I want them to be able to be independent and to preserve some level of independence. And certainly it's likely that's what you're going to hear from mom or dad. When we shift that conversation, which really is at the heart of not just adult family mediation, whether it's adult family mediation, divorce mediation, any kind of mediation, to talking about, again, not what you want, but why you want it, then we can really broaden the conversation to start thinking about what are all the different ways in which we might be able to help you achieve those interests, both the interests, that you might have individually, as well as the common interest. Because when you shift the conversation, you most often find that there's a lot of shared interests. And again, when I speak of the word interest, I'm obviously not talking about, hobbies. I'm talking about what's important to people, their wishes, their desires, their needs, about any particular topic.
And I am
So
sure.
again,
I don't have siblings, so I've never experienced it. I'm an only child, but I would have to imagine from being friends with so many siblings that importance of why allows everybody their turn to be able to give their feelings, so they feel like even if they don't get what they want, they've been heard as well, and they get to speak their piece on why they're feeling the way that they feel, and they get to be able to express that in a manner that allows all of their siblings to have to listen to them and understand what their point of view is.
absolutely. And, I'm so glad that you raised that, because at the heart of mediation, again, it doesn't matter what kind of mediation it is the opportunity for everyone to share their perspective in what we think of as, I'm trying to provide a safe container for them to do that, and to have a conversation that looks very different than the conversations they're having themselves, whether they're, in the family living room, or whether it's over Zoom, or whether it's over, the phone. And the truth is, when we really think about any kind of conflict that we have, even if it's just, trying to decide with our spouse what movie we're going to see, we all see things differently. And if you just take a moment to think about how quickly things can unravel in even the simplest of conversations, but start throwing in there all of the emotions, the high level of emotions, and the importance of the kinds of things that we're thinking about. And again, I loved your, powder keg. It happens very fast. And what I find is that even in the strongest of families, and families in which people communicate pretty well, and maybe, they're not conflict avoidant, they can manage conflict pretty well. Even in those situations, when you toss in the kind of stress and all of the angst that goes along with many of the topics that we're talking about, it's very hard to have those conversations without support. They just can break down so fast. And then what happens is that, the communication really starts to unravel. And so very often in the families that come to us, siblings, they may not even be speaking to one another. And particularly in those cases where mom and or dad, are still with us and cognitively strong, watching those relationships unravel and the tension in the family is the last thing that mom and or dad want, whether, it's an aunt and uncle, parents, grandparents, whatever it is, because cases come to us, it's not always about parents. And what I see happen is that parents will often tell each adult child whatever they think that child wants to hear about a particular topic, just to avoid the conflict. What they want was as they are getting older and they think about, at some point no longer, being with the family, they want to think that the family's going to continue and their children are going to get along. And, it's about legacy, it's about family, it's about all those things.
It's an interesting way to put that, and certainly I believe you in your experience. Usually I think about adult children being very apprehensive about those tough conversations with their parents, taking the keys away, bringing home modifications, bringing home care in, maybe moving to an assisted living. And of course, the big one is the nursing home conversation. But, you bring up that that's a two-way street, because, when you're 90 years old and maybe you don't have the energy to have those battles, or you just want everybody to be happy and nobody to be upset, there might be white lies, or those kind of telling people what they want to hear to go along to get along kind of situation, and that's only kicking the can down the road further and further. And then you have 3 or 4 different parties that are all pointing at each other, and they're all absolutely 100% right when they say, well, mom told me this, and they all contradict themselves, but they're all right and all wrong at the same exact time.
Right, and think about how that exacerbates the conflict, right? Because you know what you heard, right? And your sibling maybe heard something completely different, and it's hard when you're hearing those different messages and maybe not fully understanding the dynamics that go along with it, to not feel angry, to not get frustrated, to have a productive conversation.
Sure. So kind of that kind of explains what that mediation is. What does the process look like? I mean, somebody, we'll give an example maybe of what maybe a common situation is, or one of the more common situations are, and then what does the process look like when you're going through that type of adult family mediation?
Okay, so let's imagine a very common scenario. Adult family, one or both parents may be beginning to be somewhat compromised, whether physically or cognitively, and the adult children are struggling around, what happens next. Caregiving roles and responsibilities, whether or not mom or dad should stay in the family home, even just those two pieces. And I'm going to add to that. How to communicate and share information about what's going on, for example, doctor's visits, things like that. So those are, caregiving roles and responsibilities, communication, future living arrangements. Let's just use those as an example. So most typically what happens is I, pick up the phone, and very often it's one of the adult children, and basically saying, we're struggling. I'm at my wit's end. I don't know what to do. My siblings and I aren't getting along. We don't, decisions aren't being made, and think the situation is getting worse. Mom and dad are just not capable of caring for themselves, right now. So process wise, one of the most important things about mediation is it's a voluntary process. So there will not be a mediation unless everyone in the family, sort of the key stakeholders, agree that they're willing to participate in the process. Unless someone says, and this happens from time to time, an adult sibling might say, I trust you to make decisions. It's not a process I really want to be involved in. I'm across the country anyway, you're right there. Go ahead, I will go along with whatever decisions you make. But, that's a little more unusual. So basically, it's voluntary. We need everybody to agree. Also, and I just want to, for a moment, touch on the things that make mediation, unique as a process, kind of the foundations of mediation. So being voluntary is one of them. It's a confidential process. And there are, a couple of exceptions to that if we were to hear about abuse or neglect or somebody planning to commit a crime. But by and large, a mediator can't be required to, share what happened in a mediation or talk their notes, things like that. The mediator's role is to be neutral, to be impartial. And we can have we could talk about that for an hour about what that means. But its heart, I think about that as being there equally for every participant in the process, not taking sides, and being neutral, not only to the parties, but also as far as the issues are concerned. It's also about informed decision-making. So, it's kind of like, if you are thinking about a medical procedure, you want to understand it. And so the same thing with mediation. If families are trying to make a decision about different living arrangements, right, you want to have an understanding of what those living arrangements involve. And so very often is part of a mediation, at some point during the process, we might be sharing information about various topics with families to help educate them. And if there are things that they need more information about, or we have less information about, then we'll help them, find resources to get that information and then maybe come back. And the clients make all of the substantive decisions. I make the decisions about process, but sometimes with them. But all of the substantive decisions, that's the role of the participant. So those are really important. They're unique to mediation. So I did want to kind of put those on the table. So let's, step back a minute to our family that's called. So, I would have an initial conversation with the caller, let's say it's one of the adult siblings, and talk a little bit about mediation, what our process looks like, and then encourage them to share with their family members that they had this, this contact, that they made this outreach, and that I'd be happy to talk to other members in the family. And that's very often what happens is, I'll get another call, I'm so-and-so sibling, can we have, talk about this? And there may be multiple conversations like that. Sometimes some of the adult siblings don't feel like they need that conversation. And ultimately, we also have a written description of the process that I can email to people, share with them, which really talks about the process that we're talking about here. And over the course of sometimes, a week or two, and quite honestly, sometimes it may be months of these intake conversations, working to help the family understand the process and get on board. And, assuming everybody agrees, the next thing is we have, sign an agreement to participate, and then move forward. In terms of the process and what happens from that point forward, the first thing is that we have conversations with each participant. And when I want to also clarify what I'm saying about we. So at Elder Decisions, we use a model called Co-Mediation. And what that means is we generally work in a team of 2 mediators. That would be, 95% of the time. Sometimes I do the cases individually, but we find that with, large families, where you easily can have 4, 5, half a dozen family members, we may be spouses. Maybe in some cases there's an elder law attorney or an estate planning attorney or a trusted friend of mom or dad. Figuring out who's going to be at the mediation is another important piece of this intake process. But having 2 people hearing, observing everything that's going on in the room, being able to respond, in our view, makes a tremendous difference in terms of the mediation. Our clients really like that. So we take that team approach. So we have those initial conversations with each family. We do that as a team. So, it might be, it would be one of my colleagues and myself, just like you and I, on Zoom right now, because that's the way it's been for the last 18 months. And having a conversation, typically an hour to an hour and a half, with one of the family members. And in those conversations, we talk about, what, from their perspective, what's been happening. What do they want to talk about? What are the topics that are really important to them? What are some of their goals? What do they think might be obstacles to reaching agreements with their family members? Are there, hot buttons that could be triggering for someone? From their perspective, are there certain, what I'll call, conversation guidelines that they think would help the conversation, be successful? Anyway, there's a list of topics that we cover in those separate conversations. And once we've had an opportunity to do that with everyone, and I want to share that, when we're not in COVID times, we try to have those separate conversations with the elders in person. We think that's very important. It gives us a much better sense of to what extent the elder is able to
meaningfully participate in the process. And there can be a huge range from full participation in some cases to, if someone is extremely cognitively compromised and isn't able to follow a conversation or communicate, it might be, no active participation. That's kind of how we get the process started. And then we convene the family for the family meeting. In some cases, it might be a series of meetings. Every situation is different.
So people should understand, though, just to jump in, that this is not, my business is very crisis driven in the sense that somebody falls, 2 days later, they're leaving the hospital and they need to make a decision now. People should understand with mediation, from what you're explaining, that this is a much longer process. This takes weeks, this takes months, because depending on how many cooks are in this kitchen, you need to spend time with each individual person to understand their point of view before you're going to be bringing everybody together to have a collaborative meeting, if I can use those terminologies. What is the average length of a mediation for a family of 4 or 5? You think of a wife, elderly wife, elderly husband, and 3 or 4 kids. You're easily at 3, 4, 5 people.
So I'm going to answer that this way, because I think there's certainly a difference between the actual mediation once the agreement, everybody's agreed to, is on board, and the agreement to participate has been signed, the duration that takes, and contrasting with the phone call, the initial outreach or phone call to the end of the process, which would be, can be much longer because of what I described in terms of getting everybody on board. So in terms of once everybody is agreed and we start those conversations, that isn't necessarily very long. I mean, that could, typically we try to compress the individual conversations to do all of them within the same week. For example, we literally may do 2 or 3 of those or 4 of those in a day, and then schedule the family meeting as close to, the conclusion of those individual conversations as we can. So, it might be the same week, it might be a couple weeks. And then in terms of, from literal start to finish, in terms of the very first individual private session with a family member to the last mediation session, how long that is really depends on whether it's one meeting or a series of meetings. If there are multiple issues, and if there's a series of meetings and there might be some tasks that are happening in between meetings. So for example, let's say a family has learned for the first time about what we use, geriatric care managers or aging life care managers, as they're, we now know about them and professionally. They may want to take a couple weeks and meet with or have phone calls with some aging life care managers to figure out, who might we want to work with, and then come back and continue the planning. So there can be, might be a week or a couple of weeks in between sessions. It might be if there are estate planning issues. It might be that one or more family members wants to consult with an estate planning attorney or an elder law attorney for planning purposes. And then maybe, they might bring that information back to a next session, or the elder law attorney or estate planning attorney might be in a session. They might have even been in the first session. So it very much depends on how complex the issues are, how many issues there are. In my experience, typically it's 1 or 2 meetings. Sometimes it can be, I've had a number of cases where it's been 3, let's say 3 or 4 hour meetings to kind of tidy everything up. But there have been, occasionally there are families that we work with that, we're working with them over a period of months, or maybe they do check-ins even, once a year or once every 6 months, to kind of seeing how things are going.
So it sounds like there's some, I don't know if the word buildup is right, but there's some due diligence on the front end of things that you need to get everybody on board, and that might take some time or whatever. But once everybody's on board, that mediation can be rather fast, because that's kind of where I was leading to the question, is that if somebody's in crisis mode and something has happened where a solution needs to be come up with sooner than later, well then, people don't have weeks and weeks to go about this. There might be a bit more of a speedier need if somebody's cognitively declining, but they're a fall risk and they're living at home alone, and every day they're alone is a risk that they could really injure themselves, and people want to get moving on things. So that's interesting that it certainly could run the gamut, but there's a lot of upfront due diligence on your part. But then once everybody's on board, it seems like it can be pretty fast doing the mediation.
Yeah, and we will, we certainly do our best to bring the case to the table as quickly as possible. That I think is also just driven by how many people would be participating and how high the level of conflict is. I mean, in very high conflict cases, it may require a couple of different conversations, even with the same person, for them to get to the level where they're comfortable participating in the process. And sometimes, sometimes you can't get everybody to agree and there's no mediation. To your point about decisions needing to be made quickly, sometimes there can be a meeting that happens and you can at least get some interim decisions made. And so that you can deal with some of those crisis issues, even though there might be another meeting or meetings following that to really try to deal more with longer term planning. Another piece that I wanted to talk about, Ryan, because it's really important in terms of this whole intake / onboarding / kind of getting the mediation going process, is about the things that need to be considered when we're planning for the mediation. So one of them is who's going to participate. And I mentioned a few minutes ago, it may be adult siblings, right? And maybe it's also spouses. So sometimes that is a point of conversation that people might have different perspectives about, but our spouse is going to participate. In some cases, if there are grandchildren who are older, sometimes there are conversations about that. So who's going to participate is very important. Are there going to be any attorneys? What if mom or dad feels like they need a support person? Who might that be? So the who is important. Where is also really important. And, again, in sort of non-pandemic times, that becomes a really important question. Is it going to be at our offices? And we have very nice, very comfortable conference space where we have family meetings. And sometimes there are very good reasons not to have it in a space like that. We might meet in the conference center of our conference room in assisted living community. We might meet in the family home. So the goal is to find a place that works physically, particularly if the elders can be participating, and a place in which everyone feels like it's quote unquote neutral and feels comfortable. When? What time of day is it going to be? Again, if an elder is participating, we're all experiencing Zoom fatigue these days, right? But, whether it's by Zoom or in-person meetings, how long it's going to be and what time of day, if elders are participating, what works best for them? Can they participate in a 5-hour meeting, or do we need to, be mindful to keeping that limited to 2 or 3 hours? So that becomes, really important. What kinds of guidelines are there going to be to have the most productive conversations? And we will talk with families about that, not only in those private sessions before the joint meeting, but also at the very beginning when we come together in the joint meeting. One of the things that we talk about, early on in the day is, let's talk about how we can make the conversation most productive. And we use whiteboarding and flip charting a lot, even on Zoom. And, we'll end up with a list of things that they agree to about, ways in which they're going to strive to make the conversation most productive. In a case that's super high conflict, we might call those ground rules instead of conversation guidelines, but I much prefer conversation
guidelines.
I was going to joke, hey, at your conference, at your offices, there's no heavy objects that can be easily thrown for those situations. We only have pillows, so like nobody can get hurt here. Versus maybe at somebody's house, all of a sudden the bust of Ronald Reagan or something gets thrown across the room. But I'm sure you've seen it all, and it sounds like as much of a as your background in litigation and being a lawyer is important to doing this. I mean, it sounds like you're part therapist, part listener, part shoulder to cry on, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that have a lot to get out, and even having it to be somebody like yourself who's not part of the family, it's a weight off their shoulder to be listened to for an hour and a half or 2 hours and be able to get that out. And I'm sure there's years of frustration in some circumstances that's leading to this kind of maybe headbutting or this kind of log jam of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it is a multifaceted role. And, I was a psychology undergraduate. And I think that training also, comes in handy. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it reminds me that the principal of Elder Decisions is, her background is in social work. So we actually, when we think about a team for a family, we're often thinking about what's going to be a really good fit. So, in my case, with one of my colleagues, the complement of having a legal background, even though, in no way are we representing them as counsel and cannot and would never give them legal advice. We give them information, but not advice. And having that complement with the social work background really is helpful. And I certainly would say it is about listening. It's about listening. It's about being patient. It's about helping people see things from a little different perspective, helping them more easily step into someone else's shoes. Or sometimes we'll talk about going to the balcony and just, viewing the situation from a little different perspective, and helping bring down the temperature in the room. And again, certainly there are important experience and skills involved. I don't want to undervalue what we bring to the table and what we do. And at the same time, it's setting the table differently than they could ever set it themselves. And that, that can really help.
Absolutely. And that's a good kind of segue into kind of the third act of our conversation, our podcast, is that when should families consider adult family mediation? What are the situations that lend themselves to this? Obviously, we spoke about kind of one general situation, but what are some of those, what they say triggers or red flags that when you hear these types of things or you see this types of situation, that should immediately kind of trigger in your brain, well, hey, maybe mediation is something we should consider?
So there are so many different kinds of situations, and you're right. We've certainly talked about or mentioned some of them. So I'll do it in terms of common topics. Caregiving roles and responsibilities certainly is one. How to manage finances. Certainly if there's going to be any kind of a move, if mom or dad or another loved one is unable to manage their finances, who's going to have that responsibility? To what extent is there going to be communication and transparency around the finances? Communication and transparency is another huge topic, and I would say that it is a topic in almost every mediation. We hear concerns about, my brother, my sister, my cousin, they're not sharing information with me. I have no idea what's going on when mom or dad goes to the doctor. They had a neuropsych evaluation. I haven't seen the report. I'm not the healthcare agent, but, I love them just as much. I want to be a part of the process. You mentioned, taking away the keys. We call that the driving dilemma. And, certainly another very hot topic, as is mom or dad, going to
change residence to, you know, assisted living community. You know, I've literally sat, you know, again, pre-COVID, at restaurants, you know, and sometimes you just can't help but overhear conversations, even though that's, you know, that's not your intention. And I've heard people say, yep, you know, we told mom we were going to go take a look at an assisted living community, just to, you know, a visit. And, you know, we did, and we left him or her there. I mean, it's, from my perspective, right, it's a little horrifying. You know, there's ways to do this that, you know, it's hard, it's really hard, but those are the kinds of, you know, having conversations in advance and planning can help people to create strategies that, you know, can work for all of them. And, you know, I think what probably, you know, I find most concerning about a situation, you know, like that, or just the literal sort of taking away the keys, is that we sometimes just lose sight of the experience from the elder's perspective. And if there's any, you know, our job is to be neutral. And we also take the voice of the elder very seriously at elder decisions in our work. And we do whatever we can to make sure that we, and by whatever means, understand the voice of the elder and bring that voice in. And so, you know, that's an important goal, but lest I digress, I want to go back to your question. So, you know, driving dilemma, estate planning issues, you know, issues around, again, choice of decision makers, or what happens in a family where the parents are thinking about treating their children unequally in terms of their estate plan and will. Very often, you know, we get calls about situations where that has happened, right? The adult children weren't aware that it was going to, that was the plan. And now we've got a will contest, or we've got, you know, issues around a trust. And again, sort of families beginning to unravel. So the planning process can be also a really important one in terms of adult family mediation. And thinking about having facilitated family meetings long before we start going down some of those pathways, whether it's, you know, what happens if, this would be a conversation with, you know, parents while they're able to have these conversations. You know, what happens if there's some cognitive compromise? What happens if, you know, you fall and break a hip? What happens at the point where maybe it's just too much for you to maintain the house? What would you want? What are some of our options? To be able to have those conversations before the crisis happens, before the other shoe drops, is really important. And so we also can just facilitate those family meetings. It can be a mediation. It can be just a straight up facilitation where, you know, planning meetings around all kinds of issues within the elder space. I hope that answers your question.
No,
I mean, again, there's so many different topics.
It does. You know, part of this conversation I've had, I just finished the TV show The Sopranos, and I laugh because you watch Tony, who's the mob boss, but he's dealing with these very issues you're talking about a mother who's declining and it's a pain in his butt, and a sister that comes out of nowhere once she starts sniffing blood in the water, and hey, maybe I can get into mom's finances or things like that. I'm like, Tony needed you. That's what he needed in his life, let alone a whole list of morals. But it's very common to have those types of situations, and we experience it all the time. I mean, you were talking about sitting at the restaurant and overhearing somebody saying, "I just dropped off like mom or dad." I did care for during COVID last year. I cared for somebody who the brother basically just like called up an assisted living memory care and was like, yeah, we're just going to say she's going over there just to do a quick tour and have a nice afternoon out, and then she's never going to leave. And I can't handle it anymore. I can't deal with it anymore. And so I think, you know, that happens far more often than we realize, that people get to a point where they've gone and exceeded their breaking point, that they just have to in their head, like, make that kind of drastic kind of move or decision without necessarily considering what that's going to do for the other person who may want to just be involved in that discussion in that process. I've also sat at kitchen tables where everybody's involved and they're all cordial and they're talking and they're exploring what options I can bring to the table and seeing where it goes. So it runs the gamut, but I certainly can see where a lot of family members want to be involved in those final decisions. And it's a good point to you, and it's probably a conversation I need to have with my dad, who's, my mom passed away years ago. He's down in Florida. What happens if you get cognitively declining? What happens? Do you want to move up to Massachusetts? Do you want to stay in Florida? Where do we do? Where are we going to go? And so those are important conversations to have. They're difficult ones to have, and that's where it seems like you're a great resource for families who don't know how to necessarily break that ice and get through the conversation, keeping the family structure intact and hopefully people not feeling like they've been stabbed in the back or had the rug pulled from under them. And it allows everybody to hopefully leave that decision-making process at the very least feeling like they were heard, and maybe some of their ideas, like in any negotiation or mediation, you're not going to usually get 100% of what you want, but everybody leaves the table feeling like, hey, listen, we're doing what's best for mom or dad.
Well, that's absolutely true. And again, you triggered something else in terms of the process for me. You're right. Not everybody doesn't get 100% of what they want. What the goal is to reach decisions that everyone can live with. And so we work by a consensus building model where we essentially want to get everybody above the line, so to speak, that they can live with a decision, right? There's no voting. It's not going to be, we don't want win lose. There's no, we don't do that. And so we have this other model that we use in the process, which is called a consensus building model. And just to segue back as well, you raised such an important point about these conversations are really hard to have. And part of what makes them hard is, right, they trigger emotions within us about even thinking about mom or dad, developing dementia or, no longer being with us, in both from the adult children side and obviously from the elder side. And I think there's this natural inclination, if we don't talk about it, it won't happen. And so again, we can start out slow. It can be a series of conversations, but my biggest wish would be, in terms of families and family mediation and facilitated meetings, is for people to begin having these conversations so much sooner. So that we don't have to be crisis driven and, seeing the disentanglement that happens when families are breaking down.
Your lips to God's ears. I don't know if it'll get up there though. We're still going to be in crisis mode for a while, unfortunately. So how do people reach out to you? Obviously, one of the things that I'm sure you did beforehand, but now with COVID, since almost everything's on Zoom, or maybe you had a little break where you can meet people in person, but you're back on Zoom, that allows you to be opened up to a lot more people throughout the country that you can help rather than geographically in maybe a 20, 30, 40-mile radius. How do people reach out to you if they find themselves, whether in a family dynamics like we've been talking about, or maybe in the middle of a divorce, where they can use mediation to try to rectify those difficult situations?
So on any number of ways, certainly can send me an email. My email is Halee, Halee, @elderdecisions.com. It's Elder Decisions, all one word in that case. Certainly can pick up the phone and call at our office, and the office number is 621-7009. My extension is 28. And feel free to look at our website as well. So www.agreementresources.com, again, all one. That is our, we've actually just redesigned and updated that website
which includes various types of mediations that we do. And there's a whole section there on adult family mediation. Our other website is elderdecisions.com. We are in the midst currently of a redesign and redevelopment of that site. So, you know, it's a little bit less user friendly in terms of iPhones and so forth, but you can find most of the same information on the Agreement Resources site. I'm happy to, you know, always happy to speak with people. I try to take the time to answer people's questions and share about the process with them, and take it one step at a
And
time.
I will put all that information in the show notes. That way, if people are driving and listening to this, they can go back and just click on a website and find a phone number or shoot you an email. But thank you so much for coming on here. I think it's important to discuss the different options that people have out there. And one of the most awkward situations I've ever found myself in is when you go into a family setting expecting to be talking about the solution of home care, and half the family is still like, well, we haven't even made a decision yet. What the hell are you talking about? And I'm like, I was called by your sister. Like, I'm just a guy that showed up. And that was one of those ones where you're like, I think I need to leave and you need to make a decision before we even bother discussing this, because I'm just wasting my breath and you're just wasting your time because you're not even on the same page right now. So certainly families that are looking at that definitely need to reach out to you and consider that as an option. So I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you for the opportunity, Ryan. And you're right. You know, we don't really have a whole lot of boundaries right now in terms of Zoom. And we actually were using Zoom before as well, because very often, you know, families are spread all over the country these days. So not too much of an obstacle.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to the Caregivers Toolbox, tools for everyday caregiving. I think that's what the tagline is. Sometimes I forget. We appreciate you listening, and we will catch you on the next one.